And the FT, of course, is such a great paper. I don't know what I would do without it. As a journalist, of course, I read lots of newspapers, somewhat addicted to them. And therefore, it means that these days it's not so much about going in and picking them up. It's how many subscriptions do you have, whether it's just locally to the Irish News or the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish Times, the Irish Independent. And once I've got through all of those, of course, I have, the Times. I read the Guardian, and even though you don't have to, obviously give them a few quid because I feel like we have to. And then other papers as well. But there is one paper that I couldn't do without, and it's the FT. It is just an incredible paper. It has so much in it to read, and you can always go to it and search and find stuff if you're looking for sort of research or backup or a very clear analysis of things. And nobody better than Sarah for workplace issues, for the whole labour force issues, and for what's happening in our modern world. And there's a great weekly column, I think, the AI Shift that Sarah does with John Murdoch. And so you get the whole stats and then a bit of a conversation between the two. And it's called AI Shift. And it is really dealing with the kind of changes that AI is bringing. I noticed in a recent article, Sarah was bemoaning the inability of ChatGPT to go off and download data sets from the internet. And if you've ever used ChatGPT, I've used it, and not to write articles, but sometimes maybe to help with kind of research or to help with other projects. And sometimes really it does come across as the Simpsons episode. And if you ever remember the one of Sherry Bobbins, who is a kind of Simpsons version of Mary Poppins, who turns up and famously does a half-assed job at everything. Sometimes ChatGPT is a bit like that. But what was interesting, I think, in that particular piece that Sarah found, the kind of half-assed ChatGPT was soon replaced with Claude Code, and it was able to do the tasks that she wanted. It was able to go off and download the information she wanted. It was able to handle all of these requests from somebody who wasn't a coder. And so we are seeing these huge progressions, very useful tools at the moment, but what is the impact they're having on our jobs? What's the impact? What are good jobs in a changing world going to be like? Let's hear now from Sarah O'Connor. Sarah.
Thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm really pleased to be here, not least because my mum is Northern Irish. She's from Enniskillen in County Fermanagh. So I was expecting the weather. I was prepared for it. And I am not put off by it. It's amazing that there are so many people here on a kind of rainy evening, particularly when I know that Traitors is on at 8 p.m. So I hope we can all catch up later. This topic is very close to my heart. I have written about the world of work at the Financial Times now since sort of roughly 2010, which I'm now thinking is quite a long time. And I think that right now, this moment that we're in is quite an interesting and sort of pivotal moment. And so in this talk today, I want to kind of talk a bit about where we've come from, what's happened over the last 10 years and how we're responding to that right now in ways that I'm sure lots of you in this room know about and are involved in, and then look forward to the next 10 years and ask whether we're asking the right kinds of questions and preparing ourselves in the right kinds of way for the challenges that are going to come. So I thought I would start by asking you to cast your minds back, maybe to roughly the time of the first of these lectures. I think you said it was it 14 years ago, the first? Yeah, so 14 years ago, we thought, the only problem we really had was that we'd been through an enormous global financial crisis, which seemed like enough, but little did we know what was to come. At that time, I was a junior economics reporter at the Financial Times, and one of my jobs was to write up the kind of monthly labour market data. So just what's happening in the UK labour market as it came out from the ONS every month. And the story every month for years was the same. It was a surprising rise in the number of jobs. Jobs are coming back faster than any economists had predicted. We started calling it Britain's jobs miracle. It's so weird that everyone thought there would be a long, long recovery after the losses of the financial crisis, but that wasn't the case. And employment roared back, and then it continued to rise. And before long, every month, we were having new record employment rates. And in many ways, this was a good thing, but fundamentally, I'm a reporter who likes to get out of the office and take my notebook and put my comfy shoes on and go and see what's going on in the world. And I had this sense that if this was a miraculous recovery, it also seemed like a bit of a joyless one in some ways. And I wondered why that was. You know, we knew that wages were not going up in real terms. We knew that productivity was stagnant. We knew that ill health was on the rise, and we knew that people didn't feel particularly happy and as if things were going particularly well. And so I started going to have a look at what some of these jobs were like, these new jobs. And the reason that I put this particular illustration up, this is an illustration that was made for one of the first columns that I wrote at the FT, which was about really some of the things that I was finding. What I like about this illustration is I think it illuminates a sort of truth about the UK labour market over the last 10 years, which is in some ways it's been quite modern and forward-looking, but in other ways there has been this sort of slightly Dickensian underbelly to what some of the world of work has been like, particularly for people on low pay. And what I came to believe quite strongly was that caring about the quantity of jobs isn't enough, that you have to care about the quality of them. And it's a lot harder to measure the quality of jobs than the quantity, which is why we often focus so much on the numbers. But actually, how good your job is, how it makes you feel, whether it allows you to sustain a family life, a home, a sense of security is massively important for our health and our well-being. And what I started to do was go to workplaces where there was a real sense that there was a divide, and there were some people that were living in this kind of quite modern, functioning 21st century labour market, and there were other people often side by side with them who were having to exist in something that was not so dissimilar to the kinds of conditions that you might have seen hundreds of years ago. So I'll just give you one example, and just to say, because I'm a journalist, a lot of this talk is going to be about stories and real life and what the labour market looks like on the ground, because I think that's hopefully something I can give you that maybe you can't get from statistics or from roundtables and things like that. And it's one of the sort of privileges of my job that I get to go out and meet people who have stories to tell. So this is actually, this is just a stock photograph, but this story was about a ready meals factory in Sheffield. And in this factory, there was this sort of hidden seam of inequality, which was that there were the majority of the workers, maybe sort of 60, 70%, had permanent contracts. They'd worked there for a long time. They had holiday pay, they had sick pay, they had regular hours, and they knew how much money they were going to earn. But there was also a big group of agency workers who were on 0 hours contracts, who didn't have holiday pay, whose sick pay would only kick in on the 4th day of illness and then would be statutory sick pay. And although they did the exact same jobs on the exact same production lines, pumping the exact same mashed potato, their lives were really different. And I interviewed a woman who was on the right side of this divide, who had one of these permanent jobs, and she felt terrible about what was happening to the agency workers. So to give an example, sometimes the line would have to shut down. It might be in the middle of the night because there was a problem, a maintenance problem, or maybe an order had been cancelled last minute. And what would happen is that the permanent workers would continue to work, and if they couldn't work on that line, they would be given other jobs to do. But the agency workers were just sent to sit in the canteen unpaid for the rest of that shift. And this factory was sort of in the middle of nowhere on the outskirts of Sheffield. So there were no buses until the morning. And so the agency workers would just have to sit in the canteen all night, not being paid, not able to sleep, until they could get the bus home in the morning. And what was happening is that the employer had found a way of shifting all the risk of variable demand onto the shoulders of a small group of workers who were probably the least able to sustain it. And there were other ways in which this inequality played out, sometimes like quite small ways, but actually when you think about it, quite important ways. So the permanent workers, they knew when their shifts would be and how many shifts they would have, so they could buy a kind of a weekly pass for the bus to get there. But the agency workers had no idea. They had to wait each morning for a text message from the agency to tell them if they had that work that day or not. And that meant they couldn't buy the weekly bus ticket, which was much cheaper, and they had to buy the much more expensive tickets on the day as and when they were called in. And all of these things add up. And I don't think this was an isolated example. So this chart you're probably familiar with. This is the growth in the share of people on 0 hours contracts. And, you know, that very big steep line there is probably slightly a statistical artifact in the sense that suddenly people knew what 0 hours contracts were. And so there was a sort of a recognition perhaps of what was already there, because they really sort of entered the news in the early 2010s. But you can see that from 2015 onwards, they've sort of basically continued to grow. And I don't want to overstate it. I mean, if you look there, it's sort of like 3.5% of the workforce. So it's not everyone. It's not as if the entire workforce is living on 0 hours contracts. But this is not a negligible number of people either. This is more than 1 million people. And not everyone is in the position of those ready meals factory workers. There will be people here who have a kind of mutually beneficial flexibility in their contract, whereby their employer might say, do you want to shift? And they have the right to say no. And it works very well for them. But in a way, that's the point, is these statistics can never tell you the stories behind those numbers. And so you can tell yourself a reassuring story about that, or you can tell yourself a less reassuring story. But if you look at who tends to be on 0 hours contracts, it's normally the lowest paid. It's migrant workers. It's young workers. And what I would suggest is these are really the wrong people to be shouldering the most risk in society. I don't have to work on a 0 hours contract. I know how much money I'll be paid every month. But if you're already quite close to the poverty line and you're also having to manage huge ups and downs in your monthly income, then that becomes extremely difficult to handle. Another kind of way in which this inequality and insecurity plays out is in sick pay. So the UK has some of the most meagre sick pay in the OECD, as I'm sure most people in this room are aware. These charts are from a survey that the UK government did a while back. And the reason that I put them in there is I think it just really highlights this idea that the people most able to bear risk are the ones least expected to bear it. So you've got your managers, your directors, your senior officials, your professional occupations. Probably most of the people in this room, including myself, get occupational sick pay. You know, your employer will pay you when you're off sick for a couple of days. I don't expect that if I have a cold and I need to stay in bed for a day, that my pay will be docked. But I also get like a reasonably good salary. But it's people who are on the lowest pay with the least incomes who also have to deal with the fact that they might lose 3 days worth of pay when they get ill. And similarly, you can see the contrast there between the permanent and the temporary workers. And so what I think this is telling us is that the UK labour market might have been very good at generating jobs, but a lot of these jobs are not the sorts of job that you can really build a life on. And over the course of the last decade, that's been something I felt very frustrated about and have written about. Another kind of example of this, and I think this one is more nuanced, is the gig economy. Now, I think sometimes all of these things get conflated, and people say, oh, the gig economy, to describe maybe what's happening in that Sheffield factory, as well as, you know, a delivery rider, or indeed, this is kind of these screenshots here are from a company called Temper, and this is the sort of the new face of the gig economy. So this is, you can now, if you're a young person, you can volunteer to be a self-employed worker in a shop. You can kind of register for this app, and you might go and work, you know, in a retailer one day, and then in a cafe the next day, and you're technically self-employed, so you don't have any employment rights at all. Now, the gig economy, I think sometimes the critics of the gig economy overdo it, in the sense that most people I've interviewed who work on these apps actually are there for a reason and do find the flexibility of that valuable. But that being said, there's clearly a problem when a rising chunk of your population has no access to any of the employment rights that that very similar groups of people would otherwise have. And it's also a big problem for HMRC because both you and the employer are paying a lot less tax under this employment model. And finally, and this one still shocks me to this day, it's just that we're not very good at enforcing the laws that we have. So even though I would say the UK has been quite a lightly regulated labour market, we don't really enforce those laws very well. So on the left here, this is an article that I wrote about Leicester, which really at the time was a kind of a country within a country. So many tiny factories, really sweatshops, crammed into decrepit warehouses in the centre of Leicester, where the going rate, everyone would tell you, was sort of £3.50, £4 an hour. And weirdly, I was tipped off about this story from someone in central government who said, you should really go and see what's going on in Leicester. It's kind of crazy. And it was an open secret. So people in government knew this was going on. People in local government knew it was going on. A lot of the major retailers knew about it. And yet nothing was really changing. And I went to Leicester and I interviewed a worker he'd come over to Leicester from India sort of 20 years before and had seen his pay and conditions slowly worsen and was now receiving sort of £4 an hour. And he tried to leave that sector. He tried to get another job, but the only other jobs available were in sort of big sort of sandwich factories and food packing factories. He was sort of 60 years old, and those jobs involved standing in a refrigerated space, standing on your feet for 10 hours a day. So he didn't have a lot of good options. And he said to me, you know, people know what's happening here and they just don't do anything about it, which I just thought was such a kind of bleak indictment of the authorities, really. And on the right, this is just a chart showing that as we have sort of pulled the minimum wage lever, which is the one lever that we have been pulling to try and improve things in the labour market, our ability to enforce it has been in decline. And that was really my great frustration with the Conservative government through the course of that decade, the 2010s, was that I think they wanted to improve work, but the only lever they were really pulling was the minimum wage. So they did push up the minimum wage. And in many ways that was successful, certainly didn't have disemployment effects, but nor did it really do anything about any of these problems, and arguably possibly made some of them a bit worse, in the sense that as an employer, if your labour costs are going up, then you might find other ways of squeezing the wage bill, whether that's higher use of 0 hours contracts or experimenting with self-employment models, or indeed doing what these employers were doing, which is just kind of ignoring the law altogether and seeing if anyone would do anything about it. So fast forward to today. The good news is I think this is now very clearly recognised, this notion that actually the quantity of jobs isn't the only thing that matters, and that the quality of jobs matters too. So as everyone knows, we've just sort of passed in Westminster a big employment rights bill. I know over here in Holyrood you're working on the same thing, although I gather it might be slightly delayed, possibly. So is this an answer to some of those challenges, to some of those stories, to some of those people? Are these bits of legislation going to make the world of work better? Overall, I'm pretty hopeful. I'm going to talk you through the sort of my view, just as my personal view, the kind of the good, the bad and the ugly of this legislation. And this is mostly based on my understanding of the UK law, because I'm based in London and mostly write about the UK. And obviously that's the one that's already kind of passed into law. But hopefully it will be helpful for you guys as you think through what's going to happen here as well. So first of all, and I'm not sure if it's been the same here, but in London, there has been a sort of a narrative, I think, from the proponents of this bill and from its opponents, that what's happening is massive, that it's a huge upheaval. You know, so Labour says this is the biggest upgrade of rights in a generation. And then the business lobby say, this is a massive, huge increase in our costs, and it's going to hugely sort of complicate the ability to hire. So the reason I like this chart is it kind of puts it into context, both in a historical sense, but also sort of geographically. So what's happened here is that this very clever team at Cambridge University have found a way of essentially sort of putting a numerical value on the strength of employment law in different countries. And obviously, like, you know, there's slightly there's going to be some subjectivity to some of their judgments. But I think overall this is quite helpful. And what you see is that, you know, clearly you can see there was a massive deregulatory moment, as everyone knows, in the 80s. And then under Tony Blair's government, there was a huge increase in employment rights. And then this final uptick just here is the new bill. And I don't put this here to sort of denigrate it, but just to say, you know, this is not as seismic as people would have you believe. That doesn't mean that it's not important and it won't have interesting repercussions, hopefully for better and possibly in some ways for worse. But this is not something comparable to what happened in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s. And that's not just kind of these guys saying this. I interviewed recently a very experienced employment partner at a big law firm in London, Lewis Silkin, who was there. He founded their employment practice. He's been there for sort of 30 years. And he said the same thing. He said, look, this is a kind of a moderate change, but it's not kind of absolutely transformative. All of that said, there is clearly a lot to look at. So what are some of the really good things? I think it is a really meaningful attempt to tackle some of those problems at the bottom of the labour market, particularly around insecurity for lower paid workers. So I think it's positive that there are attempts to tackle 0 hours contracts. I mean, the caveat here is that, and I don't know if it's necessary to do it this way, but it has become unbelievably complicated to try and work out legislation to ban 0 hours contracts. I mean, obviously they're not actually being banned, but in the attempt to sort of ban the exploitative parts, but enable employers to still have flexibility and workers, we've ended up with, I mean, in the UK, they've slightly sort of kicked it into the long grass, so it's all going to go to consultation. But I talked to some lawyers recently who said that even they had got to the point where they didn't really understand it, which I think is a bad sign. However, I think the intention is right. Day one sick pay is a very good thing. But just to say, it will still be at very measly levels compared to most European countries. I mean, in most European countries, you would get like a replacement percentage of your income rather than this kind of flat, low rate. So Germany, I think, is 100%. Sweden is 80%. The other thing I think is really good is that the government compromised on their plan to offer day one rights to unfair dismissal. I mean, that would have been, this chart here shows at the minute, I think it might be different here in Northern Ireland, but in the UK at the minute, you have to wait 2 years before you have the right to claim for unfair dismissal, which really made us outliers. But if we'd gone to day one rights, we would have gone whoop, all the way to the other end, which would have also been quite extreme. So I think 6 months, which is where they've landed, puts us, you know, alongside Australia, Germany, Sweden, Norway, you know, sensible sort of countries. So I think that's probably a good thing. Other good things, I mean, I'll say a little bit about this and maybe come back to it. I think the sort of the most radical but least discussed part of the bill is this idea of fair pay agreements, which initially Labour had wanted to roll out more widely, and they've ended up just focusing on the social care sector for now. But this is essentially an attempt to bring back sectoral collective bargaining, which is something that we haven't seen in the UK for a long time. And we know there's been a lot of sort of work done by the OECD and places like that, that depending on exactly how sectoral collective bargaining is structured, it can be very positive, both for wages and for productivity and for sort of protecting jobs in times of uncertainty. And I think it's an experiment worth trying, because it would be a very different way of doing industrial relations. And in some sectors, I think it makes a lot of sense. Whether care is the right sector to go for, I'm not sure, because the fundamental problem there, as I'm sure you're all aware, is just a fundamental lack of funding from central government. So I think a fair pay agreement might be necessary, but probably isn't sufficient to sort out the problems of social care. Also, just to say, I think Labour has kind of copied New Zealand, which also brought in fair pay agreements. And that turned out to be a bit of a cautionary tale, because New Zealand brought them in, was very excited about them, but they never got sort of buy-in from the kind of the business side at all. So New Zealand's equivalent of the CBI was dead against them, didn't want anything to do with them, refused to sit down and negotiate them. And there was a sort of a decision that if the parties couldn't agree, then the government would just kind of decide what kind of minimum pay and conditions would be. But ultimately, as soon as the Labour government was out of office, they went away, because they didn't win the argument there. So I think that's a cautionary tale, and I think it's probably why Labour is trying to do this very slowly and gradually. But I'll come back to why this is important when we talk about the future. Finally, now this goes to the Leicester point. We're creating the Fair Work Agency, which brings together lots of kind of, I think about 6 different enforcement bodies in the UK that enforce different parts of employment law, which was always a kind of very fragmented and not very helpful way to do it. So bringing them all together into one single enforcement body, I think makes sense. I think it's going to be tricky. So Matthew Taylor, if any of you know him, has been put in charge of making this work. I've got to know him quite a bit just through the kind of reporting that I've done. And I think he'll make a good go of it, but it's not going to be easy, as I think he would also agree, not least because the culture of some of these organizations is so different. So the GLAA is like a kind of law enforcement body. They like will kick down doors and go and drag people out, and you know, they're going after gangmasters on farms and stuff like that. Whereas HMRC are much more conciliatory, and they want to work with employers, and they kind of expect the best of everyone. And so how that's going to work sort of culturally, I'm not sure. And just to say that what will really matter, a bit like with the care sector, it will be resourcing. So at the minute, not only do we have a fragmented system, but we don't have enough people to try and check what's going on in the labour market, as you can see from this chart here. And we don't know yet how well resourced it will be. So the bad. This was a bit of a strange one. This happened at the last minute in Westminster as a sort of a negotiation between employers and unions and the government. It was quite interesting in itself. Suddenly there was a sort of tripartite moment where they needed to get this piece of legislation across the line. And what they agreed to do was to remove the cap on unfair dismissal claims. Now, this is something that I had not heard anyone asking for or complaining about. I was not aware that anyone thought this was a particular problem. It will make the UK a real outlier internationally. Lots of labour markets, which we would think of as more heavily regulated, do have caps of one form or another. And it's sort of most likely to affect sort of highly paid executives who have stock options and things like that. So most ordinary people don't really bump up against the cap anyway, because their earnings just aren't high enough. So the risk of it, according to lawyers that I talk to, is that you might just get a load of, you know, hedge fund managers fogging up the system, which really is already overwhelmed, massively overwhelmed, when the employment tribunal system should really be for people who are seeking redress to things that are more important, but possibly with lower sort of monetary tags attached. So yeah, so I think that's a bit of an odd one, and I don't think it's particularly good. Now, the ugly bit, and this is the bit that worries me, is the timing. So in an ideal world, you would increase employment rights at a time when the labour market is strengthening, when employers are hungry for workers. You know, 5 years ago would have been good, 10 years ago would have been fine. Right now, we're just past that point, and everything is telling us that the labour market is slowing. I mean, it's not terrible by any means in terms of employment rates. We've still got quite high employment rates. But we do know that unemployment is rising, particularly among young people. We do know that job vacancies are falling. And we know that employers are very cautious for like massively understandable reasons, related not just to what's going on here, but lots of global things. So it feels like a suboptimal time to be doing this. Now, you don't always get to choose your timing, of course, and if you just waited for the perfect moment to do things, you'd probably never do anything. But I think if you were to do this at a time that was not optimal, you might try and do something to sort of sweeten the pill for employers, and Labour's sort of done the opposite. So not only are we making it somewhat more expensive and more challenging to employ people with the Employment Rights Bill, but the government's also implemented a massive increase in national insurance contributions for employers, and is still pushing through quite big increases in the minimum wage. And as you can see on this chart, what that means is just the cost of employing people, particularly at the bottom, is going up. Now, I mean, I talked earlier about how at a time when the jobs market was growing and employment was rising, I had this real sense that like what matters is the quality of jobs. So maybe I'm sort of slightly contradicting myself now, because actually there are trade-offs, I think, between quality and quantity, and we might be about to see that, you know, particularly at a time where demand is not massively strong. You might find that, yes, you're improving work for the people who are in it, but as often happens when you increase employment rights, you benefit the insiders at the expense of the outsiders, people who don't have jobs yet. So that would be young people in particular. And so we are seeing quite worrying increases in youth unemployment now, both among graduates and non-graduates. The other thing that I worry about is that this chart here massively sharpens the incentives to deploy kind of gig economy style employment models. And some of those platforms that I showed you are kind of playing on this very explicitly. They have pages on their websites that say, hey, employers, are you worried about your national minimum wage going up? Are you worried about the new Employment Rights Bill? Here's an employment model for you. You don't have to employ anyone. You can just get people, you know, shift by shift from our flexible platform. So I think that's something that we should keep a very close eye on as well. The other thing just to say, and I think you're in a better position here in Northern Ireland, but in the rest of the UK, our labour market statistics have become very unreliable because response rates have collapsed. And so what's slightly nerve-wracking is that we're doing something that's sort of interesting and I think mostly positive, but also slightly risky. And we're doing it really with a blindfold on, because we do not know what's happening in the labour market, not really. And we might not know for quite a while. And so that makes it nerve-wracking. But that's not to say that it still wasn't the right thing to do something. So that's the last 10 years. Now I just want to turn, let me see how much time have I got now. About 10 minutes left. I'll just turn in 10 minutes to the future. I'm sure long enough to talk about the future. So are we fighting the last war? I sometimes have thought in the last year, you know, people have had their heads down so much in this legislation and into the weeds of like, what's the right way to sort out 0 hours contracts? And, you know, and meanwhile, there are some quite big potential changes happening. And if you believe the kind of Sam Altmans of this world, then all of this is going to be irrelevant soon, because there isn't going to be any work. We'll be freed from labor, and AI and robotics will be able to do everything for us. Now, I don't think that's realistic, but I do think we should start thinking about how we're going to navigate some of the challenges that will be thrown up by AI, and not just AI, but further automation and intelligent robotics as well. And I think the thing to do is to hang on to that lesson that we learned over the last decade, which is that quantity isn't the only thing that matters. And weirdly, I think we already have forgotten that. So whenever economists talk about the impact of AI on the world of work, it's all about job displacement. How many jobs are going to go? Whose jobs are going to go? which jobs are going to be created. It's all very sort of quantitative. But actually, I've been working on a book over the last couple of years, which is about how work is changing now with these new technologies. And one of the things I've realized is that what is more important, I think, is how these new technologies change the nature of our jobs and our relationship to our jobs and how we feel about our jobs and whether we enjoy our jobs or not. Because I think it's becoming increasingly clear that you're not going to have a kind of AI agent that is going to replace wholesale an entire occupation. You know, we've been hearing for years now that junior lawyers are going to be the first ones on the chopping block. But actually, there's a pay battle going on for junior lawyers. Junior lawyers' pay is going up. And you don't need an economist to tell you that when demand falls for something, then the price doesn't normally rise. And so, I don't think we're going to see jobs being wiped out wholesale. But what we are going to see is that within jobs, we all do lots of different tasks. And some of those tasks probably will be automated or have the potential to be automated. And then the question we need to ask is like, are we going to lose the things that we didn't like doing? Or are we going to lose the things that we did like doing? Are we going to lose the things that didn't matter to us and didn't affect our sense of pride in our work? Or are we going to lose the things that did? And already, I think we're seeing some signs of both of those happening in different professions. So one example would be translators. So that you might have the impression that translators are probably just gone, right? That AI can do translation now, so probably there are no translators left. Well, that's not the case. There's still lots of translators, but now what a lot of them are doing is something called post-machine translation editing. So they're given a machine translation and they're asked to tidy it up, check that it's accurate. And they're asked to do this at twice the speed for half the price. And is that an improvement in their working conditions? No, it's not. The ones that I've interviewed say that they have lost a lot of satisfaction, a lot of joy in their work. Their work feels more mechanical, more intense, less fulfilling, and they're getting paid less for it overall. So there are ways in which this could go badly, but there are also ways in which it could go well. And I want to just leave you with a kind of positive story. So this is from a chapter in my book where I went to a mine in Sweden. So this is me looking a lot happier than I actually felt at the time. I am 1.5 kilometers under the surface of the earth, beneath a kind of Swedish pine forest on the fringe of the Arctic Circle. And this mine is one of the most heavily automated mines in the world. It's run by a Swedish company, and they have most of their vehicles that are driving around there now are autonomous. And so the miners who would have been driving the vehicles in the mine, they now sit in a control room, and they have sort of big banks of computer screens and some pedals, and they kind of oversee the machines, and they look more like investment bankers than miners. And I was really curious about like, how has this gone for them? Do they see this as an improvement in their job, or are they threatened by this kind of technological shift? And Sweden is interesting because it has a completely different labour market model to us. I mean, I don't want to explain to people who I suspect are quite expert already, but just very briefly, sectoral collective bargaining is very much a thing in Sweden. Co-determination is a thing. So there are union members on boards. When new technology is coming in, then the union and the employer have to sit down together and negotiate it and talk about it in advance. The union doesn't have a right of veto as such, but they do have kind of hold-up power. So they have many ways that they can sort of resist if they're not happy with the kind of the new technology as it's coming in. And you might think that that would be like a recipe for sclerosis, but actually what was happening in this mine was sort of the opposite, which was that in many ways, the kind of relationships between the workers and management and the structures that they had in place to talk about things and to sort of address problems before they manifested themselves had allowed the employer to really push ahead and to be like at the very forefront of automation without the workers feeling that they'd lost something along the way. So just to give you a few kind of tangible examples, which I found really interesting. So when they wanted to start sort of automating elements of the mine, they had to put in Wi-Fi. You know, it hadn't occurred to me, but obviously it's quite hard to get Wi-Fi 1.5 kilometers below the surface of the earth, but they did it. And once they did it, it became possible to have a kind of real-time positioning system so that they could know where every miner was at all times in this mine, which from a safety point of view sounds ideal, right? But the miners were quite nervous about it. And they said, well, hang on, we don't want to be treated like Amazon workers. One of the miners said to me, I don't want the bosses to know, like, every time I take a piss. And so they sat down and they talked about it. And they negotiated, and they basically came to an agreement that what they would do is they would go back to the technology vendor and they would pay for the technology vendor to tweak the system so that the employer would be able to see where everyone was, but not who they were. So everyone would be anonymized in the system so that you get the safety benefits, but without the miners feeling that they are being surveilled, that there's the possibility that they'll be surveilled. And under certain circumstances, like emergencies or to investigate accidents, then that could be de-anonymized. But that as a general rule, it would be kind of an anonymized system. And I thought that was a really interesting example of how something that could otherwise have gone quite wrong without anyone even having any bad intent. You know, the employer could have just put that in thinking, well, that'll be good for safety. And the workers might have felt that they weren't being trusted or that they were being watched. And they'd managed to avert that by talking about it first. And I asked some of the workers whether they were worried that they were going to be displaced ultimately by these, the fact that the trucks could drive themselves. But because they have members on the board, and because those members on the board have access to all the corporate information, they knew what the state of the company's finances were. And so they knew that actually, in order to keep digging deeper in that mine, they had to be able to do it more efficiently and at lower cost. And so for them, the choice was like, we embrace this automation and we keep going with this mine, or we don't embrace this automation and the mine stops here and we all lose our jobs. Now, it won't be that clear cut in lots of other employers in the years to come. But I think what was crucial was that they knew what the real facts were, and that meant that mistrust didn't have to grow up. You know, they could look at the books and they could see that this was really necessary and not just something that the employer was saying in order to get them to comply with something that was not in their best interests. The final thing I'll say about Sweden, which I found interesting, and then I will stop, was that they're also thinking at a big picture level about times of technological transition and how to help people adjust, because fundamentally, like, nobody knows. Like, I can't tell you how many jobs are going to go or how many jobs are going to stay. And policymakers don't know. And I think 10 years ago, there were lots of people investing in things like, do you remember those coal to coding camps where sort of former coal miners would be trained up as coders? I think they have not aged well at all, because coding is another profession which is sort of on the chopping block, particularly sort of junior level coders. So being prescriptive and trying to guess what the jobs of the future are going to be and then pushing people in to train in those areas is not going to be the right answer. So what they're doing in Sweden is they've created a policy of, it's basically like it's like a furlough policy, but for lifelong learning. So anyone who's been in the labour market for 7 years or more, I think, and has to be over 30, don't hold me to that, can take time off from work, fully paid, and they can go and study something. And the only condition is it's something that might strengthen their position in the labour market in some way. But I think that's quite a broad definition. And this is quite an expensive policy. It was negotiated between the unions and the employer bodies together, and then they took it to the government and said, we really want to do this, and we want you to fund it. And I think it's been massively popular, as you might expect. But I think what I like about it is that it sort of encourages people to sort of take matters into their own hands a little bit, which brings me to my final point, which is that we're hearing a lot of talk about AI as a kind of a tsunami of change that is sweeping upon us. You know, there's a wave coming and, you know, who's going to float and who's going to sink. I think we should be really careful about these metaphors. Metaphors are actually quite important because they really shape how you think about things. And this kind of invites us to think about technology as a natural phenomenon, something that has just happened and can't be stopped. And all policymakers can do is like make sure that there's some lifeboats available and sweep up the mess afterwards. But technology is not a natural phenomenon. Technology is made by people. It's implemented by people. And these metaphors, I think, are very helpful for technology chief executives in their conversations with policymakers, because nobody wants to look like the fool who thinks you can hold back the tide, right? But we don't have to buy in to these metaphors, and I think it's best if we don't. So in the next 10 years, as in the past 10 years, policymakers can and should legislate if they see things happening that are really bad. Like, personally, I don't think you can legislate for good jobs, because what is a good job? It really varies massively from one person to another. What is a good job for me is not a good job for somebody else. And I think Matthew Taylor slightly fell into this trap in his good work strategy. Is you try to define what a good job is, and you end up with something that's just way too specific and too ambitious. So, we can't sort of design good jobs, and we certainly can't sort of legislate for them. But we all know what is bad. We all know that it's not good for someone to have to wait every morning for a text message to find out if they have to work or not. And so if we see things happening that we think are bad, then policymakers absolutely have the right to step in and should assert that right, and should not worry about being seen as kind of Luddites or people who are trying to hold back the tide. That is not a helpful framing. But that said, I think a lot of what's going to happen is not going to be something that you can really address with policy and legislation, which brings me back to what I was saying about sectoral collective bargaining. I think, what that Swedish mine shows you, I mean, that's a sort of exemplar, probably even within Sweden, but it shows you that actually a lot of these transitions are going to happen at the micro level, within a workplace, within a company. And there are going to be so many variations in the ways in which it could play out beneficially or otherwise, that I think what really matters is who has a seat at the table when these decisions are getting made. And if workers don't have a seat at the table, then I think you don't have to be a massive cynic to think that they might well not end up benefiting from some of these changes. And sometimes that might not even be because the employer wants to do anything that is harmful to workers. It might just be that they didn't see a danger coming. But I think sort of social dialogue and collective bargaining, co-determination, at least, when it's done well, can really help with this kind of transition where you don't know exactly what's going to happen. But what you need is a kind of a level of trust and a level of experimentation and a level of kind of confidence in each other to find the best way forward. And so my question to all of you in the room, and maybe a question that we can discuss here, is can unions and employers rise to that moment over here? And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Marvellous. It's wonderful to get the whole context there set for us. You don't have to sit at the front just yet, because we'll hear from Stephen and Ethel, and you don't have to sit in front of the audience till we're ready to chat. So grab a seat, and then we'll get the others up in a minute. So I'll save my thoughts and questions for when we get into the question and answer session. There'll be a chance, obviously, for all of you to engage as well. So have those questions ready. So just to respond to that, on behalf of the manufacturing sector and I suppose private sector in general, then if I could ask Stephen Kelly. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Jim. Jim explained at the beginning that he jumped on an airplane, came to Brussels with us at the beginning of the whole kind of Brexit issue. And it was actually our very first trip as a business community from Northern Ireland. And Jim rang me out of the blue and said, I've heard a rumour you guys are going to Brussels. Can I tag along? And I says, well, I didn't tell you that. And you'll have to fix up your own access and your own interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I sat for nearly an hour with Diane Dodds, who shouted at me, blaming me bringing the BBC to Brussels with them, and it wasn't my idea at all, and I never invited Jim along. But I'm a dairy man. I'm not a tout. I didn't explain where the source of that first piece of information was. So yeah, Jim and I've had a bit of experience, and I still haven't told Diane where it came from. You'll be glad to hear. Thanks to Paul, Lisa, and colleagues from the NERI Institute for asking me to come along. I didn't get much of a briefing, didn't get much notice either, but I didn't get much briefing for today. So I deliberately decided to do what I always do, which is just wing this for the next 10 minutes. So I don't know what's coming next. So hopefully you'll bear with me on that. But I just thought it was important to listen to Sarah and kind of respond to some of the things that she was saying. We have a different labour market than the rest of the UK. If you just take unemployment as an example, I know you said that Northern Ireland statistics seem to be a bit better than the rest of the UK, but we're essentially at full employment here. We're 2.1% unemployment, and that's the single biggest challenge that I hear from employers day in, day out. There isn't the available labour. So their response to that, as what I've encouraged them to do, is to assume from this day forward you will never be able to recruit anybody ever again. And if you went in as a business strategy with that in mind as your starting point, what does that mean in terms of being a good employer? What does that mean in terms of automation? What does that mean in terms of driving terms and conditions? What does that mean in terms of trying to demonstrate to other people in and around your community that actually they should leave their employer and come to you because you're a better employer than them? So what we've seen, certainly in our manufacturing community, I know that Lisa's work has been very informative in this area. We have a really great employment sector when it comes to our manufacturing community. Good jobs exist there. And what's driving that is actually the scarcity of labour, because it's such a competitive labour market that they can't afford to be a bad employer. Second thing is that good employers hate bad employers. Apart from anything else, they take down an entire sector. It gives them a bad reputation. I'm sure if you stopped, not that anybody would dare be walking out there tonight, but I'm sure if you stopped 100 people in the street and asked them where the good jobs are, the last place they would probably say is our manufacturing community, because there is a reputation of old, dirty workplaces, bad conditions, probably less money, etc., etc., etc. And that exists today with the examples that you used in terms of Leicester. Thankfully, I don't believe we have any equivalent examples here in Northern Ireland. But that bad behaviour at the extreme end when it comes to what was happening in those sweatshops in Leicester, but on a local level, by treating people poorly, poor conditions of employment, poor workplaces, is actually really frustrating to everybody else in the sector, because they were trying to encourage people, particularly in the constrained labour market, to actually come and move towards them. You're absolutely correct. When the Chancellor back in October, I think it was 24, announced the changes to national insurance contributions and to a lesser extent national living wage, the reaction was almost instantaneous from many manufacturers. I had one great employer in Northern Ireland who sat down with the back of a serviette and worked out that overnight that cost that business about £650,000. In the year previous, they made £420,000 of profit. So that was wiped out instantly. So I said to him, well, what's your reaction to that? What are you going to do about that? And he said, it's simple. I've already rung people at home. I've told them, stop all employment. We're not recruiting anybody ever again. Drive automation, and where we possibly can drive automation. Previously, that was at the production end, but they do that really well because they were driving that really hard. Now this was in their HR department and in their accounts department and in other locations. Now, what he did say was, we're not going to lose any more people, but we're not going to be recruiting anymore because it's too expensive to recruit them. So it was about changing the jobs, and that policy in terms of the national insurance is what really drove that. We see what the UK government's doing. We've a different employment regime in Northern Ireland. So it's devolved, largely a devolved matter, and we do have our own good jobs bill that's coming through. I have to say that in 12 years in this job, I've never had a more difficult morning, which happened to be my 54th birthday. But I spent it in the company with 150 angry manufacturers, with Lisa facing up on behalf of this good jobs agenda. And they were deeply concerned about what was being proposed by our local economy minister in terms of the Good Jobs Bill. 75% of it was no issue to them. It's because it's what they largely do. These tend to be family-owned businesses with the family name above the door. They attend weddings and funerals, wakes of people. There's actually children and of people who work in the factory named after the people who are owning the business, which is extraordinary. But at the core, they're from and live within that community, and they feel a responsibility to the people that live there. So all the good stuff around different types of leave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they're saying all of that's fine. We're absolutely support all of that. But where they drew the line was on the voice and representation piece. And it's maybe because of two things that suggest. One is our experience here in Northern Ireland of how trade unions are working within certain businesses. And the second thing is our culture of them and us. The workplace was actually the place that the peace process began in many respects. There's a factory not too far away from here, and one of my first visits in this job was going down and visiting them. And the thing that really struck me that day was they were on an interface in Belfast. And he said, when I first started here, we had two gates. We had a gate for the Protestant community and we had a gate for the Catholic community. But once they came through that gate, they were in the workplace, and it didn't matter who they were. They were neither Protestant nor Catholic. They were colleagues and they were working together. He says, so my first action was I closed the two gates and just created one gate because we needed to break all that stuff down. And that stuck with me in the 12 years I've been with it, about trying to avoid the workplace as a place of conflict and to remove any of those them and us attitudes. The other thing that's kind of really happening, and there's a whole network now begun in our manufacturing community in Northern Ireland, is that the drive for productivity has been driven by lean manufacturing practices. That's not driven from the top down in organizations. That's exclusively driven from the bottom up. At its extreme end, there's this thing called the 2-second lean. And at the core of that is what they call the Gemba people. So it's a Japanese concept, which is all the good ideas in any organization and any business come from the people who are doing the job. And the management don't just encourage them, but they validate and they give permission for people to break things and break things in order to fix the things that really bug them, and to do that every single day. Now, at the extreme end, we have businesses like Seating Matters, who everybody in the business has to make a 2-second improvement to everything that they do every day. And if somebody does something and it doesn't work, the entire workforce stand there and applaud them and congratulate them. And then they go, but this is what I'm going to do to fix it tomorrow. So culturally, all of that improvement, that productivity drive is coming from the Gemba people, as they describe it, but that bottom-up improvement. Nobody knows the job better than the people who are actually doing the job. And permitting them to fix the things that really bug them is incredibly empowering, and is what's changing very, very many manufacturing businesses across the north. I started by saying that most employers really can't afford to be a bad employer. You can't attract particularly a younger generation into an environment that they don't feel comfortable, that they don't feel respected, that they don't feel that their contribution has been recognized. And I'll finish with a kind of bit of a text that I got from one of our incredible employers. They employ 1,000 people here in Wales and in Poland. A great success story, 37-year-old business. Again, family-led and family-run. But when he heard more about what was happening in terms of the Good Jobs Bill in particular, he shared a commentary with me. And it says that Northern Ireland's business success story is built on the enterprising spirit and strong work ethic of its people. It is the dedication, innovation, and perseverance of our workers and our business owners that have driven our prosperity. In the main, this has not been through political intervention. Yet now we risk undermining the very foundations of the progress that we have made. Across the country, employers treat their employees with fairness and respect, The industrial unrest that once defined our past has largely disappeared, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual benefit. Why stir things up? The reality is that most manufacturers in Northern Ireland operate on a modest margin. If the additional costs and regulations currently being proposed are imposed on employers, many will face difficult choices. Some will be forced to move production, leading to job losses at home. Others may turn to automation as a cheaper alternative. We must protect what makes our economy strong, our people, our innovation, and our competitiveness. And policymakers should support these strengths and not jeopardize them. For him, a person who's already employing, is a good employer, people in good jobs, his entire business is driven by the people that are working within there. He's seeking support to try to continue that success. We have a government here that isn't necessarily regarded as being great at running public services, never mind running good public policy. And for him, he doesn't want to see his business morphed into that type of environment that he sees elsewhere. He wants to continue to see the people in his business thrive, and alongside that, his business thrive as well. And in his view, that's best done with people working together rather than regulating in order to ensure a different environment. Thanks very much.
Stephen, thank you for that. Just to finish from one more respondent, then we'll get into our question and answer session. I'd like to invite Ethel Buckley from SIPTU to give us her perspective. Thanks very much, Ethel.
Is this working? Yeah. So just want to thank the Nevin Economic Research Institute for inviting me and the opportunity to address this lecture, which is a really important event, annual event in the Nevin's calendar, I guess, and it's an honor to be here. And I just wanted to start as well by saying something about Sarah's work, because I read Sarah's work. I saw the competition between you and the AI journalist, which is one of my favorite little videos of recently, and you won. Right, very good, very good. Your 400 words was better than theirs. But I think it's really, really important that, I think investigative journalism is important. That's the first thing to say. But I think it's really important to have quality journalism looking at the world of work. And certainly in Ireland, there has been a rowing back of funding of positions for journalists who are covering work and industrial relations in particular. That's not a good thing, you know, but I think trade unions generally don't think it's a good thing. But it's also really good because I think you in your work draw attention to exploitations and patterns that we as trade unionists can draw attention to, but people will say about us, oh sure, of course they're going to say that. They're a special interest group or whatever. And the media isn't always very supportive and friendly of trade unions. So I think it's really, really important that you do the work that you do. So it's funny, I was getting a little bit of PTSD there listening to you on 0 hours contracts and the legislation in the UK on 0 hours contracts. So in the Republic of Ireland, I was one of 3 people who negotiated on the trade union side the 0 hours contracts legislation, which was introduced there in 2016-17, negotiated and went on the statute book in 2018. It's the Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Act, but generally referred to as banded hours. That's the PTSD bit. Incredibly, I don't know if people are familiar with the UK legislation, but it's incredibly complicated. There's no two ways about it. I used to think it was just me, but what is it trying to do? What was the issue that we were seeing that it was trying to address? So at that time, I was working in our services workers division. So organizing and doing collective bargaining on behalf of very low paid services workers, quite vulnerable people. And from about 2012, 13, 14, 15, we saw an exponential rise in the number of 0 hours contracts. And I guess the thing about 0 hours contracts is just they're often correlated with very low pay, sometimes under the minimum wage, but really it's the uncertainty and that piece that you were talking about, Sarah, about putting all the risk on the employee and the people in the labour market least able to take the risk. So I guess what we were trying to do with that legislation was to ban 0 hours contracts. That was our first goal. And to a certain extent, I think we did. Not fully, but I think we did. They're much less prevalent now. And then the other thing is that the actual hours that workers were working would be reflected in their contracts. The actual patterns that they could show would be reflected in their contracts. Then to guarantee a certain amount of hours and also to have written statements about hours. So to bring back some certainty. And I think that the proposed provisions in the Good Jobs Bill should be welcomed. They're not perfect, but they will be a big improvement for the most precarious workers in the most uncertain circumstances. And I have known and represented workers like that. The impact of not being able to plan or to be aware of your income or plan your life around working hours is really devastating. And of course, it has all sorts of implications as well about, there's an issue there with housing, securing renting, not to mind mortgages, securing loans even. But the other thing about it is, in my experience, with workers at that part of the labour market, dismissal isn't really an issue. Dismissal started to not be an issue in our representation because they're so precarious, the employer just doesn't call you in again. There's no big moment of dismissal, you know. So I think that's to be very welcomed, but I take the point on how complicated it is. On your last slide here about legislating against bad jobs, I agree with that. But I'm particularly interested in legislating for and supporting how we can make jobs better, how we can promote good jobs. And I think the end of your presentation was really, really interesting, because how I heard you was, I heard you saying that collective bargaining and social dialogue was a beneficial thing at the enterprise level. You were describing it. And of course, all of the research now, and not from Friends of Trade Unions in particular, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, they say, those institutions say that collective bargaining and higher wages are correlated with and linked to higher productivity, enhanced innovation, safer workplaces, healthier workplaces, and better employee well-being. These are facts. And I don't want to get into, I'm not into it, not here for adversarial argy-bargy with the employer representative, Stephen. But the question I ask when I hear about your hard day, I'm 54 as well. That's, all those days are hard. The whole year, actually, every one of them is what I'm finding, especially in January. But I just wonder, like, how can they afford not to unleash the benefits, the productivity and innovation benefits of collective bargaining? And the description of the Japanese style, you know, everyone, it's the people who make the widgets know how to make the widgets better and faster. Completely agree with that. I completely agree with it. I've seen it happening in SIPTU's Ideas Institute with our workplace innovation programs, where we go in and we help employers to unleash that innovation, to unleash that team working. But in return for that, workers need a seat at the table then, and workers need to be able to contribute to discussions about change, to discussions about their health and safety, and they need to have a say in their wages. Because there are good employers, definitely, but in my experience, most employers will try not to pay workers what they're worth if they can get away with it. Not a controversial statement. I think that's, and particularly employers who are mandated to drive profit for shareholders and owners. That's what they're there to do. So you need the counterbalance of trade unionism and collective bargaining to ensure that workers get a fair share in that kind of workplace, in that kind of setting. And that's really what I want to go on to talk about then. I'm absolutely obsessed with sectoral collective bargaining. I'm really, really interested in it. I've done a bit of it. And I'm interested to think about and talk about how sectoral collective bargaining operates differently to enterprise or company level bargaining. So I think it's easier to kind of imagine company level bargaining or enterprise level bargaining. You know, you're dealing with the local issues in the plant or in the company, and you can imagine the absolute benefits of tackling the business processes, the administrative processes, the manufacturing processes there in the plant, workers and managers together. I guess what sectoral bargaining is it's cross-industry bargaining, isn't it? It's multiple employers from multiple work sites, and it's a little bit different. I myself think that there's a place for both, and I think they can be complementary. It's not exclusive, you know. And for example, in SIPTU, in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, childcare work is grossly undervalued, enormously undervalued work. It's education and care, it's undervalued and it's low paid. And in the Republic, we made a decision to target that sector for a number of reasons. Our members who were parents were complaining about the cost of childcare and the fact that there wasn't enough supply, there weren't places. And the workers were on minimum wages. Now, a lot of these workers had done 3 and 4 years in college before entering that sector, that industry, and they were still on the national minimum wage, which is less than the living wage. So we had to think about, okay, what do we do here? There's over 4,000 workplaces in the Republic of Ireland, childcare workplaces. Are we going to rock up to each one of them with no right of access, which I'm going to come back to about the Good Jobs Bill, no right to access the workers in the workplace? How do we get that? You know, it's unrealistic. It's very difficult organizing, okay? And I would argue that sectoral collective bargaining has a real role to play in the unionization of dispersed workers. So you have 200, 400 workers in a factory or in a hospital or in a train station or an airport or a university. That's a certain style of union organizing. You have 5, 6 childcare workers in over 4,000 workplaces. It's very different. And it particularly if you can't get access to them, if you can't get in to talk to the workers at work because for whatever reason. So I guess what we have done, we've unionized that industry. We've taken wages out of competition. This is a really important thing about sectoral collective bargaining. And I think it's particularly suited to industries where wages or labor cost is a very high percentage of overall operating cost. So it is on wages that the employers are competing. And so say, for example, in government-funded outsourced work, like social care, elder care, residential care, childcare, big construction projects, public procurement contracts, oftentimes it is on the labour cost piece that the employers are competing. And who loses out there? Workers, race to the bottom. In fact, public procurement contracts awarded on lowest price promotes a race to the bottom in working conditions and wages. But if you can take wages out of competition, and that is essentially what sectoral collective bargaining does, it introduces a wage setting mechanism that sets a statutory floor that applies to all the employers in that industry. And I could not agree with Stephen more. What's the worst thing for a good employer? It's the bad employer next to them, undercutting them, the cowboys that undercut them. And unions don't want to get involved in raising wages in a company that can be undercut by a cowboy with worse jobs. Why would you want to do that in those types of industries? The best way to not do that, I would say, is the introduction of sectoral collective bargaining. I can say a bit more about that if you want. So a couple of years ago, 4 years ago now, we established sectoral collective bargaining in childcare. And every year we negotiate the childcare employment regulation order, and it applies to 26,000 workers in over 4,000 workplaces. Slowly, incrementally, the women's, there's only 2% men in the industry, the women's wages are rising from the minimum wage. And this year we achieved, which was kind of a real goal for us, which is 15 euros an hour in a union. So we achieved 15 euros an hour. But we're also bargaining on other issues, not just wages. Your final question there, can unions and employers meet the moment? Unions need a couple of things to happen to meet the moment. Yes, is the answer on unions' behalf. Unions could meet the moment. The problem is that during that time of deregulation of the labour market, what's also going on is a tax on unions and unions' rights to operate. So the Working in Ireland survey, and I know that there are people working in this university involved in that survey. When we were negotiating the transposition of the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive in the Republic of Ireland over the last year and a half, the officials in the department told us one of the findings of that is about to be announced, as I understand it, in the next couple of weeks for the Republic of Ireland. And that is that 40, maybe 41, 42% of workers not in a union want to be in a union. And as I understand it, and you'd expect, the numbers for Northern Ireland will be similar. That's 750,000 workers in the Republic. It's about 240,000 in the North. It's about 1 million workers on the island wish to be in unions, but either can't be or aren't. Now, I'm not going to say unions are faultless and don't have a role to play in that, but I am going to tell you it's because it's so difficult to unionize workers in both those economies and both of our jurisdictions. So what unions need is legislative and procedural supports to do the work that we need to do. And one of the key things that we need, just going back to the issue of getting blocked from going into creches or factories, in the private sector in particular, we need that piece that's in the Good Jobs Bill about access, workplace access and digital access to workers. Because no union official, I'm looking at my colleagues from SIPTU here, no union official wants to negotiate on behalf of workers that have not mandated them. We want to engage in meaningful negotiations on the issues that are important to people. How do we find those out? We have to meet them and have conversations and get mandated. So that piece, I would say that piece on access to the workplace is really significant as well. And I understand that Lisa in particular is doing a lot of work to talk through with employers why the sky isn't going to fall in if and when that happens. I understand that, but it does need to happen. If legislators and policymakers and politicians are interested in good jobs and an economy and a labour market that allows unions to organise, then I think that is a really key piece. That and protecting our shop stewards. But I probably don't have enough time to go into protecting our shop stewards, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ethel. So let's get into our question. Do you want to rejoin us here? And